What is up, everybody? This is Mr. Hill coming to you on National Teacher Day. Hope you guys are having a good day. Um, I am going to go through our first lesson in the Gilded Age, guys. The Gilded Age, really, really simple as far as key themes. When you think about the Gilded Age, you're thinking about the Second Industrial Revolution. So we're talking about 1865 really being the start of that Second Industrial Revolution. 1865, of course, is the end of the Civil War. And when you have this Second Industrial Revolution, you see things like electricity. You see things like steel, massive mechanization, the factory system, and all of these things. New World immigrants coming into the New World. With this, you're going to see a perfect storm of wealth being created here because you have this emerging factories, you have these um, railroads that are connecting the country together more than ever before. And so you see business owners, these industrial tycoons, become the first millionaires in US history, multi-millionaires, in fact, because they are making this tremendous wealth by exploiting low wage labor, especially immigrants. They are able to buy these new machines that are able to mass produce products. And then, just as importantly, there is a laissez-faire approach to business. There's a laissez-faire approach conducted by our government, and that's why in this time period we have we call this the era of the forgettable presidents. And you have people like Garfield and Chester Arthur and Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. All of these presidents are going to be in this time period, the Gilded Age, in which you largely forget what they've done because they largely didn't do a lot and they allowed business to really run the country. And so this time period, 1865 to 1900, is also a time period where we see lots of problems created, lots of really poverty, slums in the cities, alcoholism. And this is the time period, guys, that really sets up the progressive era at the turn of the century. When we get into the 20th century, that's really pretty much the start of the progressive era. And you know that because in 1901, that's when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. And Teddy Roosevelt is our first progressive president. And so this time period, you just got to think of it quite simply, is the time period that sets up the progressive era. And so almost everything that can go wrong does go wrong in this time period. And we've actually already talked, as far as this review, we've already talked about some of the presidents in the Gilded Age. And if I may just contextualize a little bit for you guys, here we are starting in 1865. And so that, of course, is the end of Civil War. And so Abraham Lincoln is our president for the first 4 months of the Civil War. And then tragically, he's killed by John Wilkes Booth at Ford Theater. And because of that, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes our new president. And he is going to serve until his term is done in 1868. And then we have Grant. And so Grant is he's our first really elected president in the Gilded Age. And Grant is known especially for political corruption in his presidency. When you think about all the things that happened, we have the Credit Mobilier scandal or the Black Friday gold cornering scandal. We have all these different things that go on during Grant's administration. And this is very characteristic of the time period in general, guys. The Gilded Age, we see lots of corruption, both from the government, like the Grant administration, and you also see this from businesses that are forming pool agreements and trusts and all these things. And so this era is characterized by greed, corruption, and lots of inequalities of wealth. And so that's where we kind of start our conversation today. The Gilded Age, 1865 to 1898. So we have our second industrial revolution. We've got railroads, we've got big business, political machines, another element of corruption, laissez-faire government. Unions are going to start as a result. We are going to start talking about unions. We've only briefly talked about unions before. In our early nation's history, unions were considered illegal. But in 1842, Commonwealth v. Hunt protects the rights of unions to come together, to unionize. And so that is a big win for unions, and unions are going to try and gain more power in this time period as a result of the fact that workers have no rights. Another big part of this era is New World immigration. We have these new immigrants coming in, coming over from this time, unlike our Old World immigrants who are coming over from Ireland and Germany. These immigrants are coming over from places like Poland and Russia and Italy and Eastern Europe in general. And because of this, we're going to have a lot of immigrants that vary very differently than our very Anglo-Saxon Protestant American culture in this era. And so, as is all times in which we see lots of immigrants, we see spurs of nativism. We're also going to see a movement to help these immigrants coming in. That'll be the settlement house movement. Settlement house movement is a big movement because it's women once again getting outside of the home and moving into a political sphere that's going to help women move closer and closer towards suffrage. Something we won't talk about today, but we will talk about in this time, in this period, is the movement west, the ever movement west that is really going to end in this time period when you look at it, because here we are all the way till 1898 already, and 1890 is our official closing of the frontier. But this time period between 1865 and 1890, tremendous amount of westward expansion, and no bigger reason than the Homestead Act, which passes in 1862, that's going to have people grabbing their free land out west. Also, obviously, with the end of the fighting of the Civil War, we have people moving. But this brings us in the 1870s to our Indian War era, kind of the last stand of Native American tribes in trying to resist westward migration. This is also the time period where the West unites politically. We see our Populist Party emerge. Both these two things we will talk about in our next lecture in part 2. Okay, key dates I'll talk about in our next lecture because we're not talking about them quite yet, although we will talk about the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, but I'll talk about that as we get to it. All right, guys, so this time period is the biggest innovation in this time period are railroads, and that's partially because the Bessemer process is revolutionized in this time period, which makes a very cheap and easy process of creating steel, which helps lay the tracks and much more durable tracks that railroads can run on. If you look at the change between 1865 to 1900, how much miles of track are laid. This is more miles of track than all of Europe combined, and this shows that the United States is becoming the manufacturing giant in the world, the richest country in the world, because we have a set of unique circumstances and factors that allow the United States to flourish unlike European countries, one of which is just the available resources, the available land, and the available laborers that are working to come in and lay these tracks, although it's very dangerous for very low wages. The U.S. government in this time period, guys, is laissez-faire, which means they're very hands-off. They allow government to regulate itself by the laws of supply and demand. Really, one exception to this is railroads. The U.S. government sees the need to have railroads connecting their country together, especially a transcontinental railroad from east to west. And because of this, the U.S. government's going to give loans to 2 private companies to be able to build these railroads. That in itself is not laissez-faire government, because that is the government taking a hand in the economy. But that is really kind of where the United States government is in this time period. They're going to try to aid business in any way that they can. And usually that's not interacting at all, laissez-faire economics. But in this case, to get the country moving and build these railroads, which is going to drastically help business, they're going to give these massive loans called subsidies to private companies in order to build these railroads. And they're going to benefit themselves from this because they're going to get preferential rates. Also, the Postal Service is allowed to ride on this. When you build these railroads, this is going to create these boom towns overnight where we see if the railroad passes by, that's where a city can be created. So communities are going to fight to have railroad stops in their town. And the first transcontinental railroad, the big one, what we now call the Transcontinental Railroad, although in fact there's there were 5 built when it was all said and done, was created by two companies, one of which was the Union Pacific Railroad. That portion of the railroad was created by the Credit Mobilier Construction Company. Credit Mobilier Construction Company is infamous because it made all of these tracks, laid all these tracks with money that was given to them by the government, and then they hired themselves for inflated wages. What that means is they conducted grafts, and they netted $73 million in profits when they did this. Another example of the corruption of the Gilded Age. From the other side of things, we have the Central Pacific Railroad that's coming out of California, out of Sacramento. It is being financed especially or headed by Leland Stanford, a former California governor, who's a rich businessman. And we see these two lines meet together in Ogden, Utah in 1869. At the time period, this was celebrated as one of America's great achievements, one of the world great achievements. We rang the Liberty Bell. People compared it to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it was that big. And railroads do have an absolutely huge effect on the United States. They have lots of different elements that really transform American society. But who laid these railroads? Primarily, if they're coming from the East Coast, it's going to be the Irish. If they're coming from the West Coast, they're going to be the Chinese. Why would these two groups especially work these railroads, lay the railroad tracks? Because it is a very, very dangerous job. Hundreds are going to die laying these railroads in Indian attacks, and then in dynamite explosions, for instance. As you're coming over from the West Coast out of California, you have to go through the Sierra Nevada mountains. In doing so, they would have to blast through rock to get there, sometimes hanging down from a cliff to blast through these rocks. Very dangerous jobs. It was said that for each mile of railroad laid, an Irishman lays beneath the tracks, which obviously is very sad, but shows the utilization of cheap labor in this time period. And then how do railroads affect the United States? Huge, huge effects. One, opening up markets for manufactured goods. That's probably the biggest one, because now you have all these manufacturers, and they're based primarily in the North, over in the Northeast, formerly New England, but also just other northern states. We have all these new factories emerging. Until you have railroads, you can only produce as much as you can sell to people by sea or in your local area. And that limits the amount of consumers you can have. Once you have a railroad that is connected to your city, you now have the ability to sell to consumers all across the country. You now have quintupled your amount of consumers. You have doubled and then 10 times the amount of consumers that you can possibly sell to because of these railroads. And so it opens up the possibility to sell to more people, and therefore we're going to mass produce. We're going to produce more goods. And so this is going to encourage industrialization, encourage the opening of factories. And then the same thing for the West, and the same thing for raw materials from either the West or the South, because now we have all of these factories opening up, and because now the raw material producers now have more consumers, you can now produce as many raw materials as you can. This is going to spur the mining industry. This is going to spur farming industries even more. So that's awesome. It's often news. It's stimulating agriculture, especially out in the West, with wheat and cotton down in the South. We see the creation of cities, which we've talked about. Immigrants will come over to the country now, knowing that they can quickly get over to available land and farms out west. The time zones are created by the railroads because of all of the different cities had different times, and therefore it was dangerous. You could get into railroad accidents. And then more than any other single factor, railroads helped make millionaires. And one such example of this was Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt. Made his initial money in the steamboat industry. And then once he was already a millionaire, he is going to use this money to invest in railroads. And he's especially going to invest in railroads in New York, where he buys a bunch of smaller eastern railroads and then connects them to bigger railroads, and then controlling these bigger railroads now, is able to charge inflated rates. But he doesn't do that at first. He's a smart businessman at first. He is going to use steel. He's one of the pioneers of using steel on railroads, and because of this, his railroads were simply better. They were safer. They were more durable. They didn't run out as quickly, and people started to take his railroads over other railroads. And then he starts putting people out of business, other railroads out of business. When they go out of business, he buys their businesses, he buys their railroads, and so he starts to monopolize control of railroads in the Northeast. Is this illegal? Well, for when he started doing this, no. As time goes on, yes, it was illegal, but who is going to prosecute him? He had all the money in the world and could oftentimes buy journalists or politicians to not prosecute him. And this, of course, is where big business gets into the crime industry. Great quote from Cornelius Vanderbilt here: "Law, what do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" And he would regularly, as did many of these railroad kings, bribe judges and legislatures, give free passes to journalists and politicians, and engage in what we call these pool agreements. And what a pool agreement is let's say, Vanderbilt owns several lines in the New York area, and then Daniel Belzberg owns, 2-3 other lines in the New York area. Vanderbilt and Belzberg will work together. They'll set their prices high at the exact same rate and say, okay, you can take either lines you want, but as whatever lines they take, then Vanderbilt and Belzberg will split up their profits evenly. And so they're going to work together to work money out of the public. Now, Vanderbilt, very contradictorily, or very similar to many of these other industrial giants, was also a philanthropist. He donated lots of money that he made back to the communities, although he did it somewhat selfishly. For instance, he donates money to Trinity College in Tennessee, which becomes Vanderbilt University. And of course, their mascot is the Commodores. Okay. Railroad strikes. Yes. Labor is going to try to come into their own in this time period. Labor is certainly going to need some help from the federal government, and at first they do not get it. In 1877, this is during Hayes' presidency, we have a large railroad strike. The presidents of the 4 largest railroad companies are going to cut their employees' wages by 10%. The workers go on strike, and President Hayes is going to send in federal troops to stop the strikers. What does this mean? This means that the federal government is explicitly coming in and working on the side of business to put down strikes and labor unions. This shows, obviously, that labor unions have a long way to go before they actually have power to protect their workers' rights. Why is labor so weak in this time period? A big reason why is because of racial and ethnic divides. There's 2 major examples of this. In lower class workers, low wage workers, it's going to be the Irish and the Chinese. But in general, in some of the national labor unions, why aren't those stronger? It's going to be because of racial divides, especially with white Southerners and African Americans. Okay, so the first attempt by the federal government to regulate business is in 1887. So it's been a long time of unregulated business. But Congress in 1887 is going to pass what we call the Interstate Commerce Act. And the Interstate Commerce Act, in general, does not have any teeth to regulate business. And in fact, business was very clever in being able to avoid the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act when it's created 3 years later. However, this does show at least the first big attempt by the federal government to regulate business. It's going to prohibit pool agreements, although it was very hard to prove, forbid unfair discrimination against shippers, and also outlawing the charging of more short hauls than long hauls, which was a manipulative technique to exploit the farmers' wages. Okay, so inventions during the industrial age, there are many, many different inventions that are going to spur business. So we've talked about steel with the Bessemer process. What other things are going to help business operations? The register, the typewriter. Alexander Graham Bell, who was a Scotsman is going to invent the telephone in 1876. We're going to see the creation of telephone lines, which obviously is going to help business and being able to call in your order. But it's also going to help business because it's going to help the construction company and putting all these telephone lines up. It's also going to employ thousands of women becoming telephone operators. Thomas Edison is going to invent the electric light bulb. And actually, there was a little bit of a debate in class about that in my first period because many argued that Thomas Edison perhaps stole that idea from other inventors. Nonetheless, his practical light bulb is going to turn the light in today. It's actually, unfortunately, going to make working hours longer as Americans work later into the night and thus sleep less as a result. The two big giants of the era are Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller. That's when you think of the industrial tycoons of the Gilded Age. These are the two names that come to mind. They're going to make their wages in very, very different ways. Andrew Carnegie, another Scottish immigrant, is going to make his money in the steel industry in Pittsburgh. But what he is going to do so effectively is a process that we call vertical integration. And he is going to, essentially what vertical integration is, combining into one organization all phases of manufacturing. So let's use Andrew Carnegie as an example. The Mesabi iron mines out in Minnesota. Okay, that's where his steel is going to start. And he is going to own the mines up in Minnesota. He's then going to own all the ships on the Great Lakes that take the iron from those mines over across the Great Lakes to land. Then he's going to own all of the railroads that take from those Great Lakes his iron all the way over to his factories in Pittsburgh. Of course, he owns the factories in Pittsburgh and well. And so by controlling all elements of an organization, he is able to cut out the middleman and produce a product cheaper than any other steel producer can do. Thus, vertical integration, step by step, he controls all elements of production and is able to sell steel at a very, very cheap price. J.D. Rockefeller is pretty much the exact opposite of this. J.D. Rockefeller his business is Standard Oil, and he is going to use horizontal integration. And horizontal integration, instead of controlling all aspects of production, he is going to attempt to eliminate all competition. And he does this by allying at first with the bigger oil companies around him so that they can put all of their business into one trust. And a trust becomes the bad word, the evil word in the later age of the Gilded Age, because this means one company, let's say J.D. Rockefeller's company, that controls ownership stake in all of the rest of the oil producers in this trust. And by doing so, he gets to make the decisions on how much oil is produced, what price oil is sold, etc. And this is so effective that he is at first able to lower his prices, put competitors out of business, then buy their oil companies. And by the end, when it's all said and done, he controls 95% of America's oil. This obviously is laissez-faire capitalism at its highest example, because one individual controlling 95% of America's oil, certainly that is outside the constraints of what the framers in the Constitution believed should be happening here. But there were several arguments for laissez-faire capitalism. And many believe the big argument for laissez-faire capitalism is that the millionaires that were created in this time period did it on their own accord, on their own hard work, and that they did it with smart business practices, etc. And so, by regulating the amount of money that somebody can make, that is thus diminishing the American dream. And it says poor people just need to work hard and they can become a millionaire too. And so that becomes the argument for what becomes known as social Darwinism. So when you look at it, most business people are going to defend this type of capitalism as survival of the fittest, right? And when a Yale professor, William Graham Sumner, is asked about this, he says, what do the social classes owe each other? Nothing. And what he's saying there is millionaires don't owe their workers that make practically nothing anything, because those workers could have or still could go out and make a bunch of money themselves. Andrew Carnegie is going to say that the wealthy, once they have this wealth, have a moral responsibility to go out and give their wealth back for um, philanthropy purposes. He himself actually donated 350 million of his $400 million to various efforts, charity efforts, etc. He writes about this moral responsibility in his book called The Gospel of Wealth. Okay. The next law that is intended to regulate business comes toward the end of the Gilded Age, and that's the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which forbade combinations in restraint of trade. And right there already, you can see that this unfortunately has a flaw in this law. It authorized the federal government to pursue legal actions against trusts in order to dissolve them. Okay, so the trust is the bad guy. Trusts are these big organizations that are have the ownership stock in one company and that they are monopolizing markets. Okay, seems like they should be regulated. What's the problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act? The problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act is that they don't define well enough what a trust is. In fact, the actual law, a quote from the actual law is right here. Any combination in the form of trust or otherwise in restraint of trade or commerce among several states or with foreign nations is illegal. Now, by saying that in any combination that's in restraint of free trade, by saying that, this has created a problem because trusts are they're very versatile. And for instance, if you try to go out and prosecute against J.D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust, they would simply switch up the ownership stock into another company. They would constantly move ownership stock and make it very difficult to prosecute. Whereas the group that gets prosecuted by this Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 was the group that it was intended to help, and that are the workers and the unions. Unions were the first that were targeted with this Sherman Antitrust Act because the lawyers of the big businesses argued, hey, that is a group that is in the restraint of trade. Because they are going on strike, they are restraining commerce and trade, and therefore they should be prosecuted against. And they were prosecuted against. So this is a loss for labor unions at first. And the Sherman Antitrust Act isn't going to be used as it was intended until Teddy Roosevelt in the progressive era with his gravitas comes in and kind of changes the game in big business. The South is going to struggle with industrialization in this time period. The Gilded Age, very, very much a rebuilding time for the South after the Civil War. The stat up there tells you a lot. As late as 1900, the South produced less of the nation's manufactured goods than it had before the Civil War. So it's taken the South 35 years to get, they're still back behind where they were before the Civil War. And so that's obviously very telling. There are some exceptions. James Buchanan Duke makes a fortune in the cigarette industry, which makes a lot of sense. He's from North Carolina, and because there's the tobacco industries in the Chesapeake region, that there's a lot of tobacco and therefore mass producing cigarettes. He is going to donate his money to a college, which of course becomes Duke. But the major reason why the South is so slow in catching up in industrialization is that the North controls the railroads, and the North doesn't want to see their monopolies disappear, and they don't want to have to compete against the South. And the South actually has some advantages. For one, there's a lot of cheap laborers in the South right now, and if a factory had access to raw materials, they could potentially produce things at very, very cheap, and thus compete with northern factories. For instance, there was an Alabama steel industry that had a really good chance of competing with Carnegie Steel, which was based in Pittsburgh. However, the North is going to dominate the railroads and never allow this Southern steel industry to compete with Carnegie Steel. And here's why. The North is going to charge extra money to Southern producers. They're actually going to say it is more expensive to ship your steel up to the North. And they do this so that the steel is always just a little bit more expensive than Northern producers, so that Northern producers get the lion's share of the profit up in the North. Vicious business dealings going on right here. But nonetheless, the North won the war and felt entitled then to control the railroads and control the wealth. The one victory down in the South that starts to become the one of the major manufacturing industries down there is the manufacturing of cotton textiles, which of course makes sense considering the cotton is down in the South. There's plenty of whites now willing to work for very, very low wages just to have a job. So there you go. But yes, our rise of labor unions, and so we've talked a little bit about the history of labor unions, and this is a big theme that we talk about in this class. We started again with the fact that they were illegal, and then Commonwealth v. Hunt is going to say that they are in fact legal entities. But in this time period, they really start to grow, and they start to grow because of mechanization, because machines are starting to do the jobs of artisans, skilled laborers, people that used to do things by hand. And now we have this huge amount of immigration coming in we have these immigrants that are coming in and taking very, very low wages. And so the workers that were previously being paid more are now actually getting paid less because these immigrants are coming in and taking lower wages. And so now they are getting fired or having to adapt to a lower wage that these immigrants are taking. And so because of this, there's a desperate need for unions to keep wages high. The argument is, how come businesses are allowed to come together in trust or pool agreements, but the workers are not allowed to come together to raise their wages? And so unions, there's a desperate need for them. Employers could do a number of different things to their laborers. One of the most employed tactics was using these yellow dog contracts, which forbade workers from entering unions. It was actually an agreement that I will never join a union once I join your business. The first national labor unions that are created, the first is very easy to remember. It's the National Labor Union. Organized in 1866, it has 600,000 members, but it's coming in right after the Civil War. And if it's national, it's going to have Southerners in it, and that's going to create a problem because it is discriminatory to blacks. It also is discriminatory to women and Chinese. Blacks then are going to form their own labor union, the Colored National Labor Union, because of the racism of both groups involved, obviously the white Southerners especially. These two labor unions aren't going to work together, and because they're not working together, they're going to fade away. And out of their ashes comes the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor was a very, very well-run organization. They had clearly defined goals, and their biggest one was fighting for an 8-hour workday. They said that we have people working 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. That is far too long. We are opening it up to any group, men, women, whites, blacks, whoever. Pay your dues in your labor union, and we will fight for an 8-hour workday. They're largely making some successes in fighting for workers' rights until this incident, the Haymarket Square incident. Is going to unfortunately tarnish the Knights of Labor. The Knights were in Chicago, and they were engaging in a series of strikes and demonstrations, all peaceful. They weren't coming out and doing anything that was dangerous in any way. But Chicago at the time was a meeting place of anarchists. Anarchism, especially rising in Europe at this time because of the mass inequality of wealth there, with the prevailing laws there, even coming out of the feudalism and primogeniture laws, but also just with mechanization and creation of factories. And many anarchists were coming to the United States and meeting in Chicago. One anarchist meeting is going to come out just when the Knights of Labor are demonstrating. Some anarchists are going to come out. They're demonstrating against the police. They're going to throw a dynamite bomb into this crowded Haymarket Square. 40 people are going to be killed, including police. Because the Knights of Labor were there, they were on the scene. They were also demonstrating, although they had nothing to do with these anarchists. They are linked with these anarchists. They are labeled as dangerous themselves. And the Knights of Labor, unfortunately, is going to start losing membership and support very, very quickly and eventually disappear. And it will be replaced by the most important labor union that we learn about in this class, guys, and that is the American Federation of Labor. And you notice that I have federation underlined there because this is in fact not just one labor union, but several labor unions together in a federation. And that is a very important point that there are in fact several labor unions, because all the labor unions are going to pool their money together. They're going to pool their money together, and then if someone is being mistreated, perhaps the employers are going to lower their wages by 25%, for instance. Okay, we're going to go on strike. Well, when you go on strike, you're not getting paid. And so if your labor union doesn't have enough money, your strike is going to be very short. You're going to have to go back to work. Well, if you're in this federation, all of these unions are pooling their money together. And then when one union needs help, the rest of the federation can put their money to that purpose. And so the American Federation of Labor was immensely successful in achieving some workers' rights. We have Samuel Gompers becomes the president of the Federation for 38 out of 39 years in which he was a member of this. And so obviously he has a huge stamp on this. And they are going to advocate for all union labor, what you call the closed shop, where employers hire only members of unions, and that they are then allowed to, come in and fight for better wages. But even the American Federation of Labor was discriminatory, and they discriminated against unskilled laborers, and so that kind of created the need for a unskilled labor union, which isn't going to come until our next time period. We also see the growth of cities in this time period. When we get to 1900, New York has 3.5 million people, and now at this point, 4 out of 10 Americans live in a city. It isn't until 1920, the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, where we see the majority of Americans living in the cities. But why do we see so many people moving to the cities in this time period? It's especially because of the jobs, because of mechanization. That's where the jobs are, where the factories are, where the electricity is and the telephones and all of these new consumer comforts. And so people are moving to the cities. And so Americans are becoming commuters. If they're not living in the city, they would come to the city for work. But cities became very, very diverse. We had some very rich people living in the cities, and we had very, very poor people living in the cities. And so cities became segregated by a number of different things. They were segregated by wealth, by class. They were also segregated at times by ethnicity, especially if many peoples, for instance, New York, we have lots of peoples coming from Italy. They would move to the Italian part of town, forming little Italies there. So we had ethnic segregation in these cities. And then, of course, we had segregation by race because of overt racism. And this is where we start our time period of consumerism, where we are constantly producing these manufactured goods. And so we need consumers. And so we see the birth of department stores like Macy's and Marshall Field's, who can afford to come in and purchase the manufactured goods. Only really our middle and upper classes. Our lower classes often worked in these department stores, but really couldn't afford the goods in which they sold. However, the department stores did provide work for women as more and more women entered the workplace. And well, we don't get to talk about women yet, almost. I thought we were, but we have problems with urbanization. And some of the big ones, waste disposal and sanitation. As more and more Americans moved into the cities, there's a realization that there's some new problems that we've never had to deal with before. And really, as this is the era of urbanization around the world, this is problems that every country is having to deal with. We have these new cities where millions of people are living there. We have these huge strains on municipal government, on city government. How do we deal with all of this trash that is being created? When you lived on the farm, you threw your scraps to the pigs. And in fact, you really didn't have that much trash, because in reality, you weren't purchasing manufactured goods in these boxes or bottles or cans. You were producing things by yourself on the farm. Now everything you purchase at these new department stores are coming in these throwaway containers, et cetera. And so you see this huge strain on sanitation, on waste disposal. What do we do? Cities need to expand and become more powerful, but that would mean a raise in taxes and an expansion of the government. And until we get to the progressive era, this is a very, very slow in its process. Progressivism is one of the big battles, is cleaning up the cities. We need to do something to improve, especially the slums, where things are really bad. And here we are before 1900, we don't have cars yet. And so what we have instead are horse-drawn carriages, and they would do their droppings in the streets, and that would sit there because no one would be employed to come pick it up. And then it would rain and flow through the city and mix with the garbage. It was a disaster. And so cleaning up the cities becomes one of the primary goals in the progressive era starting in 1901. Okay, finally, to talk about our immigrants. So as a recap, we know that before the 1880s, we had 5 million immigrants come into the United States. The old world immigrants, those are people from Western Europe, Germany, Ireland, and then Northwestern Europe, especially England and Scandinavia. They are more or less like the Americans already living in the United States. Yes, there's a high Catholic population coming from Ireland and Germany, but more or less they are of Christian denominations, perhaps Protestant. They're fairer skinned. They're coming from places that have a history of a democratic government. They speak English, or at least speak a little English. Not the same with our New World immigrants. 1880s to 1920s, very, very different culturally people. We have Italians, Croats, Greeks, Poles. They are practicing very different religions, very different lifestyles. They have no history with the democratic government. Many of them are very, very poor and illiterate. Some are coming to escape religious persecution in their own countries. For instance, Russia was persecuting against the Poles, the Jewish Poles, I should say. But we have all these people flowing into the United States, and this wave of immigration is much bigger than our previous wave of immigration. These years, we're going to see hundreds of thousands coming in every year. In 1882 alone, we had 889,000 immigrants come into the United States. That's more than 2,100 a day. Okay, so we have lots of immigrants. This is our big age of immigrants. And because of this, of course, we have a surge of nativism. These new immigrants, every time that immigrants come into the United States, there was always a surge of nativism. They are portrayed as lesser than the quote-unquote Native Americans. And in this case, it's especially so because they're very different than our Native Americans. There was a fear that these new immigrants are going to outbreed and outvote the Protestant Anglo-Saxon Americans there and mongrelize the gene pool, blah, blah, blah. They're going to come in, and because many of them would vote in a bloc, especially groups like the Irish, that they would corrupt urban governments. They're also lowering the wages because they're coming in and taking these low-wage jobs. And so there is going to be a big movement to have Congress regulate immigration. And so while Congress isn't coming in and regulating the economy, they are in fact regulating immigration. In 1882, Congress bans paupers, criminals, and convicts from immigrating to the United States. They're also going to ban importing foreign workers already under contract, which was essentially an attempt by business to create indentured servitude, which was banned by the 13th Amendment. And the one thing that is going to help these immigrants coming into the New World is these political machines. And in fact, I say that, and it's a little odd because political machines, in fact, exploited immigrants. At the same time, they were necessary in protecting immigrants. And so a reminder of what these political machines are. These are political entities in which the municipal government is run by a political boss, usually the mayor of a city. And the mayor of the city is going to exploit immigrant votes. They're going to be, as immigrants come in every single day, down at the docks coming into the United States, like in New York and Ellis Island, they're going to give them a bowl of soup. They're going to say, let me show you a place to live. Let me try to find you a job. Let me get you with people that speak your language, doing all of these things that are very nice for immigrants. And then this is going to be in exchange for votes in the upcoming election. And what was so smart by this is that the mayors, these political bosses, would get you jobs, and they get you jobs in the government. They'd get you jobs in construction. They get you jobs in the police force. And then all of a sudden you start controlling the law because you control the police force. You control all aspects of the government of these certain cities. And therefore, this is one big machine that is being run off of this one mayor's interests, constantly being voted back into office because of the dues that these immigrants owe the political boss. And so that's what a political machine is all about. Um, Back to anti-immigrants, back to nativism. Because of overt racism, especially in California, we see the first first group excluded from being able to immigrate to the United States, and that is our Chinese. Congress is going to completely halt immigration from China in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was only supposed to last 10 years. However, it was re-upped every 10 years. And it lasts all the way until 1943, until FDR finally gets rid of it. Especially in California, some of our nativists go as far to try to actually take away citizenship from Chinese as well. But in the Supreme Court, U.S. v. Wong Kim Ark, the 14th Amendment, of course, protects Chinese Americans as well. One of our many examples, guys, of when there are high levels of immigration, there are political beings that fight back and come in to stop immigration. One slide on two presidents here. So Garfield and Arthur. So Arthur is the vice president of Garfield. Garfield is elected after Hayes. So Hayes, with our corrupt bargain compromise that starts in 1876 with the election of 1876, he's officially elected president in 1877. He's going to serve until 1881. So he is succeeded by a new Republican president, James A. Garfield. Garfield is shot 3 months into his presidency. And so his vice president, Chester Arthur, becomes our new president. Chester Arthur has a reputation for following the spoil system. He has a reputation for, as he went through his political career, constantly rewarding people that helped him get office, that helped him move through politics and rise up the political ladder. And because of this, when Arthur becomes president, there's a big fear that there is going to be even more corruption in the federal government. And already there's frustration at the level of corruption in the federal government, especially from the Grant era, from Grantism, so to speak. And so Chester Arthur is in a tough place because he's become the president, but now he has all this backlash from the people and from Congress. And so because of this, he faces enormous pressure to sign a very important bill in American politics called the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act says you cannot donate money to another federal employee if they are running for office. And the significance of this is that what we previously saw is that, for instance, senators would donate money for someone to become president, and then the president then would reward those senators by funding whatever projects they needed or maybe donating to their campaign. And so what we would have is just the senatorships being a bunch of millionaires, and the only people coming into office were very, very rich people. And so the thought process with the Pendleton Act is, let's remove the corruption from one entity in government to another entity in government. The problem with that is it doesn't fix the problem, because we still see millionaires being elected to office every time. And the reason being is that politicians, now that they can't get political donations from other politicians, start to look to big business for political donations. And that's where we see big business start to use their considerable amount of money to keep legislators beholden to them by donating to their political campaigns. Okay. There is a religious movement in this time period called the social gospel that is going to look to try and help the poor, especially immigrants, in the urban cities. And so we see Protestant clergymen who are going to come in and say that it is unjust that so many of our civilization are condemned to poverty and living in these terrible conditions. And so they are going to, through their Christianity, preach that laissez-faire government is wrong, and that there needs to be change, and that there needs to be more socialist laws that will protect these urban slums. Walter Rauschenbusch is one example of these preachers that do this. And this is kind of the context coming into the progressive movement. This kind of starts to fuel the fires for the progressive movement. Every time we also have something like this, it's also going to bring in temperance into the equation as well. Jane Addams, a big figure that we should remember. She is a college-educated woman. She went to the Troy Female Seminary as one of our first college-educated women. She's going to come out and found the Whole House. The Whole House becomes the model settlement house that inspires many other settlement houses throughout the country. This settlement houses were there to help immigrants that are assimilating into American life. They offered English classes, counseling on how to deal with American city life. If the immigrant workers had to work, which many of them did, then they would offer childcare there. And so these whole houses were just monumental in protecting these groups that desperately needed help, as the U.S. government was not helping these groups assimilate into American culture. Also, with these settlement houses, they're going to inspire women to come more into political spheres. And we already saw that with the Second Great Awakening that started in the 1800s, 1810s, and 1820s. And then we see this further with the settlement houses because it is, again, an opportunity to come in and to discuss a problem in society, being the poor and the slums. And in the 1890s, more women in general are joining the workforce because it was considered taboo if you were married or a mother to work. Most of the women working at this time were single. If they were white women, they were probably working as secretaries or in department stores, telephone operators. If they were black women, they were mostly working in domestic service, which means they're mostly working within the home itself, maybe a maid or a cook. If you were an immigrant woman, you were coming in and largely bringing over whatever skills that you had over in the old world. For instance, many Jewish women tended to work in the garment industry. In every location, in every race, in every ethnicity, women were paid less than men. But this is paving the way for the independence women movement in the 1920s. So we're getting closer to women's suffrage, which happens in 1920. Charles Darwin in 1859 writes On the Origin of Species. On the Origin of Species discusses evolution, which wasn't an entirely new concept. But he also talks about natural selection, which kind of gives some evidence to evolution, to give some reasoning to evolution, where Darwin argues that some traits give certain beings advantages in the struggle for life, and beings with these certain traits are going to survive and reproduce, and therefore eventually beings are going to evolve because more and more of the species is going to have these traits, etc. By the time we get to 1875, most scientists are going to accept this theory, and this is going to create a problem in between our churches and our scientists because so much of American society still runs on religion. We are a very religious country at this stage, and so this is going to divide and weaken many churches. And we'll see some of the famous cases in the 1920s when we're talking about, for instance, the Scopes trial, where we talk about the challenging of the ideas of the church through politics. We have two African-American leaders that have very distinct ideas of African-American rights in this time period that we need to know. One of which is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is from the South. In fact, he was very, very poor. He actually lived under a sidewalk, under a wooden raised sidewalk, and he would collect pennies that fell through the sidewalk in order to pay for his own education. This guy is an amazing story. And the factor is he is going to focus on educating Blacks and helping them become economically self-sufficient. In 1900, 44% of non-whites are illiterate. They can't read or write. That needs to change. And so he is going to head a school in Alabama, and he is going to focus on education and on helping the Black community have skills that allow them to go in and produce their own wealth. By doing so, by producing their own wealth, having their own job, being self-employed or working in a skilled industry, this is going to, as Washington argued, give them confidence, and then allow them to raise up socially in society to whether they can then challenge segregation laws and Jim Crow laws. He didn't believe in challenging Jim Crow laws yet. He said, we need to make ourselves self-sufficient. And so then once we come up to in this social equality, that's when we can challenge Jim Crow laws. To many, he made lots of sense. To some, he was viewed as an accommodationist because he wasn't directly challenging the Jim Crow laws as they currently existed. And one person that called him an accommodationist was the other leader we need to know, which is W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, total opposite sides of the spectrum. This guy grew up in the North. He went to Harvard. He got a PhD. He was the first African-American to graduate from Harvard. And as he would say, he was cocky about it. He would say the pleasure was all Harvard's. He is right away going to demand complete equality for blacks. He says, I have come in and graduated from the highest institution in the country. There is nothing that separates African Americans and whites. Why are we segregating them? They should be together. And so his argument is there should not be this gradual assimilation. This should happen right away. He argues for other people like himself, the most educated, as he called the talented 10th, to lead blacks into full political representation. He's also very faithfully going to fund the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which we'll talk about multiple times throughout this course. All right, we're almost done. One slide on literature. When we focus on literature in this class, it is just in the theme of the time period. When we talked about the pre-Civil War era, we had literature dominated by New England, especially Transcendentalism. Now here we are in the Gilded Age, and we have literature that reflects what's going on in the time period. Materialism, especially consumerism, and also conflicts in the industrial society, and also race and segregation. Kate Chopin is a feminist author. She writes The Awakening, and she is talking about the struggles of housewifery, adultery, women's ambitions that are being stifled. And this becomes a bestseller after her era, especially when we get into the 1920s, et cetera, when women have a much more active role in society. And then Mark Twain, who is to this day America's most popular author. He writes, of course, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and he's going to talk about social injustice. That's going to be a big portion of his themes in his writing, both in race and also social classes, poverty, etc. And so this is kind of fitting the age and the time period. Women. We have had a long struggle for suffrage in the United States. Our Seneca Falls Convention, all the way back in 1848, moving towards equality. Abolition is going to come to the center of movements before the Civil War. After the Civil War, women come right back into arguing for suffrage. And the National American Women's Suffrage Association is the best way, the most politically powerful group that is going to argue on behalf of women's suffrage. It was formed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Now we have a new leader, as we are much later, 40 years later, we have Carrie Chapman Catt. And the main message here is very smart. It's very smart when it comes to arguing why women should have suffrage. The argument is that still at this time, men are confining women to the home and saying this is where you have your most prominent role because you are the moral keeper of society's conscience and that sphere of domesticity and all of these things. Well, women are going to say, well, what about the fact that because we are supposed to be doing traditional duties as homemakers and mothers, we need to have political representation because there are aspects of being a mother that now have become politicized. For instance, what about the health of children working in factories? We have child labor going on right now. Isn't that something that mothers should be able to weigh in on? What about schooling, school boards, public school? This is something that mothers should weigh in on. And so because of this, NASA is going to use the argument against them as actually a weapon, and they're going to do it really successfully. An unfortunate side effect is that they are going to exclude blacks in the time period because they're looking for national representation, including white women in the South, and they thought that if they integrated their society, that this would cause them to lose popularity in the South. And so they did. They were in a segregated society, and so Black women had to do their own reforms, like Ada B. Wells, who fought against lynching, and of course, successfully eventually, but unsuccessfully in the 1890s and early 1900s. Prohibition, big one in this time period. There's lots of alcoholism in the Gilded Age, lots of drinking during the Civil War. Prohibition has been a long, long time coming. We've been working on prohibition back since the Second Great Awakening, back in the early 1800s. And so one of the big reasons why prohibition becomes such a popular reform effort in this time period is that many of these new immigrants coming over to the New World are drinking a lot. It's a cultural thing. They're drinking, and also after working long, long hours in the factory, they'd often go to the local saloon and have some drinks there. And that's their main argument against the prohibition reformers. As is always, many of the reformers of prohibition are middle-class women. And the argument by the poor and these immigrants that are doing lots of the drinking is they're saying, well, this is a middle-class assault on the lower classes. And so this is, something that they obviously are going to argue against. We see a bunch of different groups form the National Prohibition Party, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League. When we get to 1819, that is where we will see our 18th Amendment, which prohibits the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. And that creates the Roaring Twenties bootlegging era, which we're getting close to. Okay, guys, we are done. Let's talk about our partnered SAQ. This is due on Thursday. I believe today's Tuesday. Yes, so this is due on Thursday. One example of how American laissez-faire capitalism led to wealth inequality in the Gilded Age, one non-governmental action that was taken in the Gilded Age to respond to that inequality, and then one example in which a previously marginalized group became more active politically in the Gilded Age. Ooh, good questions. Okay, thanks, guys. Signing off. It's National Teachers Day. Say something nice to your teachers. Abby Miyamoto, very nice. Got an email from her. So thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.